This is an Australian plant called the Gaimea lily, although it's not actually a lily. It took me approximately 50 minutes in real time to draw, and I'm using a Copic 0.2mm pen. Now, it's an incredibly, I think, beautiful but complex flower, structure, subject to draw. So how do we draw subjects such as this that seem to have overwhelming detail, where at a glance it's such a tangle that it really does seem impossible to draw it in any realistic or even semi-realistic way? Well, let me talk through my method of drawing this sort of subject. And you can see that I've started by drawing some of the long skinny petals that down the base of the plant are even starting to curl, that I've begun to draw some of the ones that come out straight at us or to the side that don't particularly have any other parts of the flower in front of them. In other words, the easiest parts to draw because they're not tangled up with any other parts. And I'm trying to space them and position them vertically and horizontally where they are in relation to each other in the reference. Now, drawing something as complex as this, what I find is very helpful is to draw some parts slowly, accurately, and clearly, because these will be parts that will be very noticeable at the end and will help let viewers get a grasp of what they're looking at, will help the brain seize on something that it can then multiply the effect of in its mind. So I've gone across really the bottom layer of petals, if you like. Another very helpful thing to do is to get a sense of, is there an underlying structure and what is it? And what we have in effect here, if you want to even just pause and have a quick look at it, what we have is a series of large clusters of flowers that all form on basically very short stems grouped together. And as they open, their long petals go on top of and under and generally tangle up in each other. And it creates a very textured, tangled effect over the overall shape of all these flowers on the top of what's often a 5 or 7, 8 foot tall thick stem. It's a very heavy flower head that weighs kilos. So you can see what I'm trying to do at this point is to create the underlying base of all of the detail. So having drawn some of these longer petals coming out, the ones that aren't particularly tangled up, I can now trace them back to where they go down into the plant, into the bundles of them, if you like. And I've been concentrating on establishing in my mind, as well as on the paper, where those bundles of flowers are. And they also create a strong value, a strong darkness through both shade and through shadow. So I'm going to be doing a bit of hatching on this, because hatching is going to help establish the darker areas, which will help throw the lighter areas into greater prominence and just help to create distinctions between various areas of what we're looking at, because there are going to be a lot of lines close together. So now I'm drawing the top part of the flower, the if you like, unfolding bud parts, sepals that have curled away and are curling back on themselves. I probably made the base of the flower just a little bit too large, the parts that enclosed it. So now, having got a sense of where it's coming from and going into, I now get to really create the effect in a more generalized way. But before I do that, I still want to look at, if you like, the next layer of petals going upwards, and where possible, draw them relatively accurately, and to make sure, most importantly, that they curve into the same clusters of petals of individual flowers grouped together that I've already established. Because I do want a sense that if you were to trace these petals back, they do follow the underlying structure of the plant. The thing though at this point I need to remember is I don't have to be exact. I don't have to create exactly the same shapes, but I do find that early on, if I keep paying fairly close attention to the actual forms, it helps me to create the sorts of forms, the sorts of bends, the sorts of angles formed more accurately. As I continue this drawing upwards, the petals become more vertical than horizontal, and it becomes easier to do them, and the tangle is somewhat more limited. They more crisscross rather than weave through each other. So it really is across this central band which is the most complicated. And I'm establishing some of the values now with hatching, or even just in a few spots just colouring in black, to help me keep track of where the different bunches of flowers are coming from, and exactly what's petal and what's space between petal or between flowers. And then they have these stamens, these long stamens that come up, and the challenge is to draw these and not to space them all equally. I don't know that I did as good a job of that as I would have liked. Random can be very difficult to do sometimes. Now, the important thing is at this point where all these silhouettes are, that I really, again, pay particular attention on the silhouettes, on the edges of the overall plant. Because while any one leaf or petal or part of the plant is not so obvious in this great massive detail, the edges are much more obvious. And the brain will go to edges, will go to the silhouette to, if you like, take a shortcut to working out what's happening. It'll look at the parts that are easiest to look at to make assumptions. So therefore, the more clear to see and the more accurate in representation the edges are, the better they will serve that purpose in our drawing. And so at this stage, I'm also wanting to work on the scale of the flower head, of the petals, and of the overall size and shape and proportions. So this is where it's important not to get just bogged down on doing petal after petal after petal. Particularly now that I'm not having to be quite so locked into seeing exactly what's happening. The way I do it in a scene such as this is I look for the main, if you like, the main petals, the most prominent ones, or the largest sized ones, or the ones that are catching the light. And I seek to position them in the correct proportion to each other and to what I've drawn beneath. And then in between them, I now have a fairly strong idea of the sort of effect the petals at the angle they are at that part of the flower head are forming, and I can really draw the in-between parts more intuitively. The important thing is that I don't actually cross my lines over each other, that I still allow for whatever I've drawn already. I'm going to be drawing things behind that. I'm not going to be drawing things through that, because once we start to have pen lines crossing through each other, as if we can see through the parts, then we lose a strong sense of reality. So it's important that we put things in front of or behind, but not through. So I'm starting to wonder at this point exactly how dark now my hatching, cross hatching is going to be. I'm trying to get a sense of how dark and closely I'm hatching the underneath part, so that I can then get a sense of the hatching that goes higher. I don't want to be hatching too much of, if you like, the red and the pink, the petal parts from the upper half. I really don't want to be doing much hatching there at all. So therefore, I want to get a sense of how much am I going to do further down, and then from that, try and work out what I might need to do further up. Because we understand, we see the effect of values of dark and light in relation to the values next to it, to other dark and light. And so it's the sort of thing where it's very helpful to progress across quite a bit of our drawing at the same time, going back to parts we've already done and making them darker, as we think that will improve the visual drama or simply the ability to understand what we've drawn. So now I'm doing these silhouette edges, if you like, on the right hand side, and notice that they are quite different from the ones on the left hand side. And it is good to, with a subject such as this, try and make sure we again don't make it symmetrical. We don't want to put an orderly sense in it that's not there. And this is where I think it is helpful to pay attention to particular details, because that helps us to be creating the effect, but not just to drop into a kind of autopilot mindset and just start filling in gaps. Because if we do that without enough overall thinking, we'll end up creating a very even pattern of detail, which really won't say anything, and will often lose some of the vital distinguishing characteristics of our subject, such as here. So I'm just adding a few little textural marks and a few little shade marks to some of the petals, and then I get to come back down to this stem, because I'm thinking that it still needs a bit more work, a bit more effort. Perhaps if I'd used a 0.3 millimeter pen, that might have helped better for the size, for the scale of the drawing. I've drawn it larger than the reference, so maybe if I'd drawn it a bit smaller, the 0.2 would have been a better match for the amount of hatching I want to do and for the amount of darkness I want to create. Scale of our drawing is, the size of our drawing is really very important in choosing what size pen to use. So now I'm just working on these really long, tall, sword-like leaves that wrap themselves around like a sheath around the stem, and which, as the plant develops, they separate and fall back from the plant. I find them really quite magnificent specimens, and they're often used now in Australia in public areas, public spaces, and even down the middle of motorways, because they don't have much foliage very high off the ground. They have a lot of strappy flax-like leaves, maybe for a metre and a half off the ground, and then just these incredibly long 6-8 foot stems with these beautiful crowns of pinks and reds and even flashes of oranges in the sun. So I'm now just trying to create a few shadows higher up, just to help some of the individual petals and flowers stand out. But as you can see, this took me less than an hour to create the effect of a flower of incredible complexity. And except for those early parts where I was trying to copy some actual parts of the flower to help me get a sense of what I was drawing, and also to give people looking at my drawing something quite concrete to grab onto, that except for that really have been just more creating the overall effect. I haven't had to labour over exactness of what I draw according to the reference, just in enough parts that I preserve the sense of randomness and the lack of exact symmetry. There's an overall sameness, but not a precise sameness. There still is the variation from one side to the other side, from particular clumps of flowers to other particular clumps of flowers that we have in the reference. And really now it's a case of just spotting the parts of the stalk and the leaves that I have forgotten to put the hatching on and to do some of that. And then it's pretty much done. It is hard to know when to stop. I've actually painted this. These were one of the first non-tree subjects I painted. In fact, it was probably the first subject I painted 15 years ago when I began to paint in oils. That wasn't a tree. It was these Gymea lilies, because I really have enjoyed them. So that certainly was a help, the fact that having painted them, I do understand their structure. It's always worth looking at a subject intently, observing carefully before we start to draw it. What do you think? G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. Look, I hope you like these flowers firstly. I think they're amazing, but I hope you have a go drawing, because they are a wonderful example to test our skill in the technique of drawing the effect of a plant or of any subject rather than the exactness. It's an incredibly helpful technique. I use it in architecture, I use it in crowds, I use it in just about any subject you can imagine to try and capture the effect of what we're seeing, not the precise exactness. So this photo will be on my channel community page. So why not have a look at it, take a screenshot or put it up on your monitor and have a go drawing this glorious Australian plant. But look, whatever you draw and however you draw it, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.